The recording was never meant to leave that room. Somewhere in the mountains of Jalisco, a voice spoke into a device. Calm. Measured. The words of a man who doesn't repeat himself. A message intended for one set of ears, and one set only. But someone made a copy. For years, Mencho operated in silence. No interviews. No public statements. No photographs released willingly. While other cartel leaders chased fame, he built something far more dangerous: mystery. The government didn't know what he sounded like. His enemies couldn't confirm he was real. Even some of his own men had never heard his voice. Then the audio surfaced. Not through journalists. Not through law enforcement. It leaked from within, from someone close enough to record it and reckless enough to let it out. What was on that message? According to investigators who analyzed the recording, it wasn't a threat. It wasn't a rant. It was worse. It was instructions, delivered with the patience of a man who had already calculated every outcome. The question isn't what Mencho said. It's who he was talking to, and what happened to them after. There's a reason you've never heard him speak. Not in interviews. Not in courtrooms. Not in cartel propaganda videos where others pose with weapons and make threats for the camera. Mencho doesn't perform. He operates. And for more than a decade, that silence became the foundation of something far more powerful than fear. It became myth. Think about what it takes to run one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the planet and remain almost invisible. No verified photographs for years. No public recordings. No speeches, no manifestos, no social media presence. While other cartel leaders chased headlines, Mencho understood something they didn't. Silence is control. When your enemies don't know what you look like, they see you everywhere. When they've never heard your voice, every whispered order could be yours. When you refuse to exist publicly, you become impossible to predict and impossible to contain. According to investigators who spent years tracking the Jalisco organization, this wasn't accidental. It was strategy, calculated, intentional. Every piece of information about Mencho was controlled at the source. Even his own men, the ones stationed far from the center, operated on faith. They followed orders passed down through chains of command, never certain if the man at the top was real, a symbol, or something in between. That uncertainty? That was the point. You have to understand what the authorities were dealing with. They had a name, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. They had a birth date. They had fragments, old arrest records, rumors, secondhand accounts. But confirmation? Evidence of who he was now? The sound of his voice giving orders in real time? Nothing. For years, intelligence agencies worked with silence. They chased a ghost who left bodies and billion-dollar networks behind, but never a trace of himself. Reports indicate that some analysts began to wonder if Mencho was even one person anymore, or if the name had become a title, passed between leaders to maintain the illusion of permanence. That theory was wrong. He was real, and he was more disciplined than anyone imagined. His rise didn't happen on camera. It happened in rooms with no recording devices, in conversations that were never repeated, in decisions made quietly, then executed without hesitation. By the time the world understood the size of his empire, it was already too late. The Jalisco organization had spread across Mexico, into the United States, into Europe, into Asia and Australia. Not through spectacle, through silence. And Mencho stayed at the center of it all, unseen, unheard, untouchable. But power that large creates pressure, and pressure creates cracks. Somewhere, someone close to the operation made a decision. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe it was careless. Investigators still don't know for certain. What they know is this: a recording surfaced. A voice, calm, deliberate, unmistakable in its authority, speaking words that were never meant for outside ears. The ghost had a sound now. And once that sound existed in the world, everything changed. Not because the recording exposed secrets. Not because it contained threats that shocked anyone. It changed things because for the first time, El Mencho was no longer a rumor. He was a voice. Real. Human. Documented. And that meant he could be studied. Analyzed. Traced. For a man who built his empire on being unknowable, the leak wasn't just a breach of security. It was an act of war. The question now wasn't just what he said on that recording. It was who recorded it, who stood close enough to capture that voice, and then let it escape. Inside the organization, according to reports, that question began to circulate quietly. No announcements. No public searches. Just silence. A different kind of silence now. The kind that comes before consequences. If you're watching this from somewhere around the world, take a second. Drop a like. Share this with someone who needs to hear this story. And subscribe if you haven't already. Comment below with the time and where you're watching from. Let's see how far this reaches. Because what happened next didn't make the news. Not immediately. But people who study these organizations noticed something. Names stopped appearing. Faces vanished from the usual channels. Communication patterns shifted. The circle was tightening. And somewhere in those mountains of Jalisco, a man who never raised his voice was asking a very simple question. Who betrayed me? The audio wasn't long. Investigators who analyzed it reported the recording lasted only a few minutes. No rambling. No unnecessary words. Every sentence delivered with the precision of someone who had said exactly what needed to be said. Nothing more. That's what unsettled them most. Not the content. The control. According to sources who reviewed the leaked material, the voice on the recording was calm. Almost soft. No shouting. No threats delivered through clenched teeth. Just instructions. Clear. Methodical. Final. The tone of a man who doesn't argue. Who doesn't negotiate. Who speaks once and expects the world to adjust accordingly. Analysts who study cartel communications noted something unusual. Most recorded messages from criminal leaders carry emotion. Anger, paranoia, desperation to project strength. They perform for an audience, even when they claim the message is private. This was different. El Mencho wasn't performing. He was delegating. The recording, according to reports, contained operational directives. References to territories. Names, though investigators noted some were likely coded. Instructions about responses to specific pressures the organization was facing at the time. It was a business communication. Cold. Efficient. The verbal equivalent of a signed document. And that's what made it so dangerous. Because here's what the leak revealed to those who listened carefully. El Mencho wasn't reacting to events. He was ahead of them. The recording referenced situations that hadn't become public yet. Decisions about moves that wouldn't be visible for weeks. According to intelligence analysts, the timeline suggested he was operating with information most people didn't know existed. This wasn't a man in hiding, desperately managing a crumbling empire. This was a man directing traffic from somewhere no one could reach. The myth of the ghost was confirmed. But so was something worse. The ghost was winning. What struck investigators most was the absence of fear. You have to understand what El Mencho was facing during this period. International pressure. Rival organizations pushing from multiple directions. Government operations that had dismantled other cartels entirely. The logical response would be stress, desperation, some sign that the walls were closing in. The recording showed none of that. His voice carried the same weight, whether discussing logistics or consequences. No change in tone. No moments of hesitation. According to those who studied it, one word kept appearing in their analysis notes. Patience. The man on that recording wasn't fighting a war. He was managing one. And he sounded like someone who had already calculated how it would end. There's a moment on the recording, at least according to reports from those who heard it, where Mencho pauses. A brief silence. Not uncertainty. Something else. The way a man pauses when he knows the person listening needs a moment to understand the weight of what was just said. Then he continues. Same tone. Same calm. But the pause itself communicated something words couldn't. This is not a discussion. This is already decided. Those who analyze communication patterns noted that the silence was strategic. Mencho understood the power of what wasn't said. The gaps between sentences carried as much meaning as the sentences themselves. Even in a private recording, he was composing. Every breath intentional. The content itself, the specific names, the specific orders, investigators kept most of that classified. What leaked to the public was confirmation the recording existed, fragments of analysis, and the growing understanding of what it represented. But inside the intelligence community, the recording changed things. For years, they had profiles, theories, assumptions about how Mencho operated. Now they had his voice. They could study his speech patterns, his rhythms, the way he structured commands. Psychologists and analysts began building new models, not just of the organization, but of the man himself. The silence had been broken, and with it, a small crack appeared in the armor that had protected him for over a decade. But here's what they didn't anticipate. Mencho knew. Not eventually. Not through slow intelligence leaks. He knew almost immediately. According to reports, the moment the recording surfaced outside trusted channels, the information traveled back to him. How? Through the same networks that made his organization so effective. The same layers of loyalty and surveillance that had kept him invisible for so long. The system he built to protect himself now served another purpose. To identify the traitor. And this is where the story shifts. Because the recording itself, what it contained, what it revealed to investigators, that was only half of the equation. The other half was simpler. More dangerous. Someone inside the circle had made a copy. Someone Mencho trusted enough to be in that room, to hear those words, had decided to let them escape. The question burning through the organization wasn't about damage control. It was about identity. Who? Who stood that close and chose betrayal? In a world where loyalty is survival, that question doesn't get asked twice. It gets answered. Quietly. Permanently. The recording was never supposed to leave that room. But it did. And now, somewhere in Jalisco, the man whose voice had finally been heard was asking the only question that mattered. Who let this happen? The answer would cost someone everything. You don't get close to Mencho by accident. There are no open applications. No interviews. No handshakes at parties that lead to opportunities. The circle around him is built over years. Decades, in some cases. Layer upon layer of proven loyalty, tested in ways most people can't imagine. And even then, even after all of that, you might never see his face. That's how tight the inner ring operates. So when the recording leaked, the mathematics were simple. The number of people who could have been in that room? Small. Very small. And Mencho knew every single one of them. According to investigators who have studied the organization's structure, The Jalisco cartel operates differently than its predecessors. The old cartels were loud. Hierarchies were visible. Leaders gave interviews, posed for photos, built public personas that made them easy to track, and eventually easy to dismantle. El Mencho learned from their mistakes. His structure was compartmentalized. Layered. Information flowed upward, but rarely traveled back down in full. Lieutenants knew their piece of the operation, but not the whole picture. Regional leaders understood their territory, but couldn't map the entire empire. Only those at the very center saw everything. And those people, they didn't just work for El Mencho. They belonged to him. The inner circle, according to reports, was built on two foundations: blood and time. Family members occupied key positions, not as figureheads, but as operational leaders. People who shared his name, his history, his understanding of what betrayal would cost. Beyond family, there were the old ones. Men who had been with him since before Jalisco existed as a power. Who remembered the years of building, the years of war, the years when survival wasn't guaranteed. These weren't employees. They were believers. The organization functioned almost like a religion in that sense. Loyalty wasn't just expected, it was absolute. Questioning was unthinkable. Doubt was dangerous. And betrayal? Betrayal wasn't just punished. It was erased. So imagine what the leak represented. Not just a security breach, a theological crisis. Someone inside the faith had sinned. Someone who had been trusted with proximity, with access to the voice itself, had chosen to break the most sacred rule. They had let the outside world hear what was meant only for the chosen. Reports indicate that in the days following the leak, nothing visible changed. No public statements. No sudden violence that could be traced. No obvious signs that the organization was in turmoil. But those who monitor communication patterns noticed something. Silence. A specific kind of silence. Channels that normally carried regular traffic went dark. Contacts who had been reliable suddenly became unreachable. The usual rhythms of operation paused. Something was happening internally. Something careful. You have to understand how El Mencho processes threats. According to analysts, he doesn't react emotionally. He doesn't lash out. He doesn't make decisions based on anger, even when anger would be justified. He calculates. He waits. He identifies exactly where the weakness exists, and then he removes it with surgical precision. The leak wasn't going to be answered with chaos. It was going to be answered with certainty. Before anyone faced consequences, El Mencho needed to know, beyond any doubt, who was responsible. Not suspicion. Proof. Because killing the wrong person wouldn't solve the problem. It would only prove the real traitor that their cover held. And this is where the pressure inside the circle became unbearable. Imagine being one of the trusted few. You know the recording exists. You know it leaked. You know that somewhere, El Mencho is asking questions. And you know that everyone in that room is now under suspicion. Even if you're innocent, you're not safe. Because innocence doesn't matter until the guilty one is found. Until then, every glance carries weight. Every conversation is measured. Every moment of silence from above feels like the pause before a verdict. According to sources who study cartel psychology, this is intentional. The uncertainty itself is a tool. By not acting immediately, by letting the question hang in the air, El Mencho accomplishes something more powerful than punishment. He creates fear. Not fear of death, fear of suspicion. Because in an organization where loyalty is everything, being suspected is almost worse than being guilty. It means your position is compromised. Your future is uncertain. Your family's safety is no longer guaranteed. The guilty one knows they're guilty. But the innocent ones? They have to prove it. And that desperation, that need to demonstrate loyalty beyond any doubt, often reveals more than any investigation could. Take a moment right now. If this story is keeping you locked in, hit that subscribe button. Drop where you're watching from in the comments and the time you're tuning in. Share this with someone who understands that real power doesn't need to shout. Somewhere in those mountains, conversations were happening. Not interrogations. Nothing so obvious. Just conversations. Questions that seemed casual but weren't. Observations about who had access when. Quiet comparisons of stories, looking for inconsistencies. The circle was eating itself, slowly, methodically. And Mencho was watching. Waiting for someone to make a mistake. That's the thing about betrayal in this world. It's not just about the act itself. It's about what comes after. The liar has to keep lying. The traitor has to keep performing loyalty. The longer the investigation continues, the more opportunities exist for the mask to slip. And Mencho, he had all the time in the world, because he wasn't going anywhere. But someone in that circle? Their time was already running out. They just didn't know it yet. The first disappearance wasn't reported. No news coverage. No missing person announcements. No family members speaking to journalists. Just absence. Someone who had been present was no longer present. And no one asked why. According to investigators who track patterns within the organization, this is how internal consequences typically unfold. Not with spectacle, with silence. One day a name appears in communications. The next day it doesn't. Contacts who had regular interaction with that person suddenly have nothing to report. The individual simply ceases to exist in the operational structure. Whether they're dead, imprisoned by the organization, or relocated to somewhere they can never speak again, outsiders rarely learn the truth. The message isn't delivered through evidence. It's delivered through disappearance. And disappearance, in this world, speaks louder than any body ever could. Reports indicate that in the weeks following the leak, at least 3 individuals connected to the inner circle became unreachable. Not low-level operatives. Not distant associates. People with proximity. People who had been in rooms where Mencho's voice might have been recorded. Were they guilty? Were they simply suspected? Were they removed as a precaution, regardless of involvement? Investigators couldn't determine which. And perhaps that was the point. You have to understand the methodology. Mencho wasn't looking for one traitor. He was looking for weakness. The person who leaked the recording might be one individual. But how did they get access? Who enabled their position? Who failed to notice the breach before it happened? In an organization built on absolute control, one failure represents a chain of failures. And chains get removed entirely. Not link by link. All at once. According to sources familiar with cartel operations, the internal investigation likely followed a specific pattern. First, isolation. Anyone with possible access to the recording would find themselves subtly separated from normal operations. Not obviously imprisoned or accused, just reassigned. Moved to locations where their communications could be monitored without their knowledge. Second, observation. Who did they contact? How did they behave? Did they attempt to reach anyone outside normal channels? Did their patterns change in ways that suggested guilt or fear of being discovered? Third, pressure. Small tests. Questions that seemed innocent but weren't. Requests that required them to demonstrate loyalty in ways that would be difficult for a traitor to fulfill. And finally, certainty. Once the evidence pointed clearly enough, action would be taken. Not publicly. Not with any announcement. Just one more disappearance. One more silence in a world already full of silences. But here's what made this investigation different. The recording had already leaked. The damage was done. Finding the traitor wouldn't undo the exposure. It wouldn't erase the audio from servers around the world. It wouldn't restore the mystery that had protected El Mencho for years. So why pursue it so aggressively? Because this was never about the recording itself. It was about what the recording represented. If someone could betray El Mencho once and survive, they could do it again. And others would notice. The organization's power didn't rest on weapons alone. It didn't rest on territory or money or political connections. It rested on belief. Belief that El Mencho saw everything. Belief that no betrayal went unanswered. Belief that consequences were absolute, inevitable, and inescapable. If the traitor wasn't found, that belief would crack. Others might wonder if betrayal was survivable. Others might be tempted to try. So the hunt wasn't optional. It was existential. The traitor had to be found, not for revenge, but for maintenance. The empire required a demonstration, a reminder of what happened to those who broke faith. And El Mencho was prepared to turn his own circle inside out to deliver that reminder. According to reports, the pressure during this period was immense. People who had served the organization for years suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Lifelong loyalists were questioned, not through formal interrogation, but through the slow accumulation of doubt. Families felt it too. When trust collapses at the top, the tremors reach every level. Wives noticed husbands coming home later, speaking less, carrying tension they wouldn't explain. Children saw fathers checking phones obsessively, looking over shoulders, sleeping with weapons closer than before. The organization was hunting itself. And everyone inside knew that when the hunt ended, someone would not survive it. Reports indicate that some individuals attempted to preemptively demonstrate loyalty, offering information about others, making accusations, some true, some desperate fabrications. This is what internal pressure creates. When survival depends on being above suspicion, people will sacrifice others to protect themselves. El Mencho would have anticipated this. The chaos of accusations actually served his purpose. Every false claim could be investigated. Every true claim brought him closer to the source. And the desperation itself revealed who was weakest, who was most likely to have broken under whatever pressure led to the original betrayal. The hunt wasn't quick. It was methodical, patient, like everything El Mencho did. He wasn't racing against time. Time was his weapon. Every day the traitor remained hidden, their anxiety grew. Every disappearance around them increased their isolation. Every test they had to pass drained them further. And eventually, inevitably, they would make a mistake. Or someone close to them would. The circle was shrinking. And somewhere inside it, a person who had once stood close enough to record El Mencho's voice was realizing a terrible truth. There was no escape. There was no hiding. There was only waiting. Waiting for the moment when the silence finally turned toward them. And then there would be no more waiting. Only consequences. Here's what the analysts expected. Denial. A counter-narrative. A statement, direct or indirect, claiming the recording was fabricated. Edited. Taken out of context. The work of enemies trying to destabilize the organization. Standard damage control. Every criminal organization in history has done it. When something leaks, you discredit it. You flood the space with alternative explanations. You make people question what they heard. El Mencho did none of that. The recording surfaced. The world heard his voice. And he said nothing. According to investigators, this silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Think about what denial would have required. A statement, which would mean more of his voice in the world, more material for analysts to study. An acknowledgement, which would confirm the recording's authenticity to anyone still doubting it. Engagement, which would make him a participant in a narrative he didn't control. By saying nothing, Mencho refused all of that. He let the recording exist. And then he made it irrelevant. How? By continuing to operate exactly as before. No changes to his patterns. No visible panic. No restructuring that would suggest the leak had damaged him. The message to the world was simple. You heard my voice, and it changed nothing. I'm still here. I'm still untouchable. Your knowledge doesn't threaten me. This is what separated Mencho from others who came before him. Lesser leaders would have scrambled, would have issued threats, would have tried to reassert dominance through spectacle. He understood something more sophisticated. Power isn't proven by reaction. Power is proven by indifference. The recording was supposed to expose him, humanize him, make him vulnerable. Instead, his silence made it feel like a minor inconvenience, like a man brushing dust from his shoulder. According to analysts who study cartel communications, this had a profound psychological effect, both internally and externally. Externally, law enforcement had to recalculate. They had expected the leak to create pressure, to force Mencho into defensive moves they could anticipate and exploit, to crack the armor even slightly. Instead, they watched an organization continue functioning without disruption. Their intelligence advantage, finally having his voice, his patterns, his tone, didn't translate into operational advantage. He adapted around it, or perhaps more accurately, he ignored it. And that indifference was more demoralizing than any countermove could have been. Internally, the effect was even more powerful. The circle was under pressure. The hunt for the traitor was ongoing. People were disappearing. Suspicion was everywhere. And yet, the leader at the center remained calm. Reports indicate that Mencho continued conducting business as usual. Meetings happened. Decisions were made. The empire kept expanding. For those inside the organization, this sent an unmistakable signal. The leak hurt us less than the traitor hoped. We are not weakened, and we will find who did this. The silence wasn't absence. It was confidence. But there was another layer, one that investigators only understood later. The recording itself, the fact that it leaked, became useful. Not despite Mencho's wishes. Because of them. Think about what the world now knew. They had heard his voice. Calm. Controlled. Strategic. Not a ranting madman. Not a desperate criminal clinging to power. A calculated leader running a sophisticated operation with patience and precision. For potential allies, corrupt officials, international contacts, business interests willing to work in gray areas, the recording was almost reassuring. This was someone you could negotiate with. Someone who operated with discipline. Someone whose word, once given, would be kept. The leak accidentally became a demonstration of competence. According to sources who study cartel influence, this is how Mencho's reputation actually strengthened after the recording surfaced. The mystery was partially gone, but what replaced it wasn't weakness. It was clarity. People now knew exactly what they were dealing with. And what they were dealing with was formidable. If you're still here, you understand this story is different. Take a moment, subscribe, and share with someone who appreciates how real power operates in silence. Drop your country and the time you're watching below. Let's build this community together. There's a term analysts use: controlled exposure. When a leak happens, but the target manages to shape how it's perceived, to absorb the damage, and convert it into something else entirely. Most people can't do this. It requires absolute confidence in your position. It requires knowing that the information released doesn't actually threaten your core operations. And it requires the discipline to do nothing, even when every instinct screams for response. Mencho had all three. The traitor who leaked the recording probably expected chaos. Expected Mencho to panic, to make mistakes, to become vulnerable. Instead, they watched him stand perfectly still. And in that stillness, they realized something terrible. The leak hadn't damaged him. It had only damaged them. Because now Mencho knew there was a traitor. And his silence meant he was hunting. The recording was supposed to be a weapon against him. He turned it into a weapon against the one who released it. Every day that passed without his response, the traitor's anxiety grew. Every continued operation proved their betrayal had failed. Every silence reminded them that consequences were still coming. The message behind the message was simple. You tried to expose me. You failed. And now I'm coming. According to reports, the psychological pressure on the source of the leak during this period was immense. They had taken an enormous risk and gained nothing from it. The organization still stood. Mencho still ruled. And somewhere in those mountains, a patient man was waiting. Not for the right moment to strike. For the traitor to break. Because that's how Mencho operated. He didn't chase. He waited. And he understood that guilt, over time, destroys people more effectively than any bullet. The traitor wasn't just being hunted. They were being outlasted. And the silence that should have been Mencho's weakness became the sound of their own doom approaching. Slowly, inevitably, without mercy, the name never became public. No press conferences. No leaked documents identifying the source. No dramatic revelation that gave closure to those watching from outside. Just silence. The same silence that had defined Mencho before the recording. The same silence that would define him after. According to investigators who continued monitoring the organization, the internal disruption eventually settled. The disappearances stopped, or at least returned to baseline levels that couldn't be distinguished from normal operations. Communication patterns stabilized. The tension that had gripped the inner circle seemed to release. Something had been resolved. Reports indicate that those who study these organizations recognize the signs. When an internal hunt concludes, there's a shift. Not visible, not announced, but measurable in the way operations resume their rhythm. Confidence returns. Orders flow normally again. The machine that had been consuming itself suddenly turns outward once more. Whatever needed to happen had happened. Did they find the traitor? Investigators believe so. Not because of any confirmed report. Because of what didn't happen afterward. No more leaks. No more recordings. No further breaches that suggested an ongoing vulnerability. The source had been identified. And the source had been silenced. Permanently. Here's what that means in practical terms. Somewhere, in an unmarked location that will likely never be found, someone who once stood close to Mencho ceased to exist. Not metaphorically. Literally. Their voice. Their knowledge. Their betrayal. All of it erased. No trial. No defense. No appeal. Just the absolute consequence that the organization promises to anyone who breaks faith. According to those who analyze cartel justice, this outcome was never in doubt. From the moment the recording leaked, the traitor's fate was sealed. The only question was timing. Mencho could have acted immediately, grabbed suspects, applied pressure until someone confessed, ended it quickly. He chose patience instead. Because quick justice serves only one purpose, ending the problem. Patient justice serves two. It ends the problem. And it teaches. Everyone inside the circle watched that hunt unfold. They saw colleagues disappear. They felt the weight of suspicion. They experienced what it meant to be under El Mencho's silent scrutiny. And they understood, in a way that no threat could convey, exactly what betrayal would cost them. The traitor's fate wasn't just punishment. It was education, a lesson delivered to everyone who remained. Reports indicate that loyalty within the organization actually strengthened after the incident. This seems counterintuitive. You would expect a leak to create doubt, to make people question whether the organization could protect itself, to encourage others to consider their own exits. The opposite happened, because El Mencho demonstrated something more powerful than vulnerability. He demonstrated inevitability. The traitor had every advantage: proximity, access, the element of surprise. And still they lost. Still they were found. Still they were erased. If someone with those advantages couldn't escape consequences, what chance did anyone else have? The message rippled outward, not through announcements, through understanding. Those who worked at every level of the organization recalculated their positions. Betrayal wasn't just dangerous. It was pointless. The empire was too thorough. The reach was too long. The patience was too absolute. Whatever you might gain from betrayal would be temporary. The consequences would be permanent. And so the silence returned, deeper than before, more complete. El Mencho had faced the greatest exposure of his career. His voice broadcast to the world, his mystery partially stripped away, and emerged stronger. Not despite the leak, because of how he handled it. He had shown the world his calm. He had shown his organization his patience. He had shown the traitor his reach. And he had shown everyone else what happens when you test him. According to analysts, this is the moment El Mencho's legend solidified into something else entirely. Before the recording, he was a ghost, powerful but uncertain, possibly exaggerated, a figure built as much on rumor as reality. After the recording, and after his response to it, he became something more concrete. A man whose voice matched his reputation, whose patience matched his power, whose consequences matched his promises. The ghost had become flesh, and the flesh was more terrifying than the ghost had ever been. Today, years after the recording surfaced, El Mencho remains at the center of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. Still rarely photographed, still almost never heard, still operating from locations that authorities cannot pinpoint. The silence that the leak threatened to destroy has been restored. More complete now, because it's been tested. And somewhere in those mountains of Jalisco, a man who speaks rarely and moves carefully continues to build. His empire stretches across continents. His influence reaches into governments, businesses, and systems that prefer not to acknowledge his existence. His name carries weight that few names in history have carried. The recording was supposed to change everything. In a way, it did. It proved that even when the world hears your voice, they don't truly know you. It proved that exposure isn't the same as vulnerability. It proved that silence, once restored, becomes stronger than it was before. El Mencho understood something that the traitor didn't. You can leak a recording. You can share a voice. You can expose a moment of private communication to the entire world. But you cannot capture what makes a man dangerous. That lives in the silence between words, in the patience between actions, in the space where consequences are calculated before they're delivered. The recording was never supposed to leave that room. It did, and it changed nothing, because the man who made it had already planned for a world where it might escape. And in that planning, that cold, methodical, absolute preparation, he had already won. The traitor thought they were exposing El Mencho. They were only exposing themselves. And now they're gone, erased from history the same way they tried to drag him into the light. Silence restored. Empire intact. Consequences delivered. And somewhere, a voice that the world has now heard continues to give orders that the world will never know. Until perhaps, one day, another recording surfaces. But whoever might consider that path now understands something the last traitor learned too late. El Mencho's patience is longer than your life, and his silence is the last thing you'll hear.